All right, welcome everybody to our first Advanced Topics TLC Journey Analytics with our special guests, Gary Angel and Rusty Raymer and Matt Kirchhoff. Hi guys, thanks. Thanks for joining us.
Hello.
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. Let me do a quick introduction for anybody who doesn't know you guys, and if you don't know them, you need to get to know them. These are some of the smartest guys in digital analytics out there. We'll start with the guy most people probably know, which is Gary Angel. He is one of my favorite people, but he also happens to be co-founder and CEO of the brand new Digital Mortar, which is a technology platform that is bringing digital analytics capabilities to in-store measurement. He was, to no one's surprise, voted the most influential industry contributor by the Digital Analytics Association. And today he'll be playing the role of the philosopher and most likely to bring up big picture ideas and tie things together the rest of us would miss. Welcome, Gary.
Thanks, Kelly.
Second in line is Matt Kirchhoff, co-founder and CEO of Conductors. And if you haven't explored Conductors, I highly encourage you to do so. It's super fun. It's a decision engine platform that blends the machine learning that everybody talks about with A/B testing. So it's really cool stuff. He has 2 master's degrees, one in artificial intelligence, one in resource economics, which I don't even know what it is, which means he's way smarter than the rest of us. So today he's going to be playing the role of the scientist and probably the only person on the panel who really understands the AI behind Blade Runner. So welcome, Matt.
Good to be here.
And Rusty. Rusty is our business guy today. He has 10 plus years of experience driving the digital strategy at Vanguard. He's on the Digital Analytics Association Board of Directors, and he's currently focusing on journey analytics with Vanguard, which is why we've invited him today to be our business strategist, most likely to have the ability to apply Gary's philosophy and Matt's science to real-world problem solving. Welcome, Rusty.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, let's just kick it off with, I think, the most basic question that we need to start with, which is a definition of journeys. And I'm going to ask Rusty to start because of the conversations that Rusty and I had during the DA Hub about journey analytics and the problems that they're trying to solve at Vanguard. So let's start at a more detailed, practical level, and then we'll move our way up. Rusty?
Yeah, thank you. I think there is a lack of a definition, but in my mind, at least, I think of an equation, and I sort of think on the right-hand side, after the equal sign, is the journey that customers have with us, and I think of everything to the left-hand side of that being the experiences and the tasks that they're trying to accomplish, and the sum of that equaling the journey and what our brand stands for on the right-hand side, right? So, I wonder if you can get in front of a board and actually draw that out, or if that you need to focus on just sort of the chunks of the things on the left-hand side and really executing well on those tasks and trying to shape the experiences around those tasks to create a good journey for your customers. So in my mind, that's how I think about customer journey.
Okay, that makes sense. Matt, you want to tear it apart?
No, but I'd like to help contribute to build it up. I'd say for me, I'm not exactly sure of what the definition is. The way I would look at it is treating the problem or treating the marketing analytics or the marketing optimization problem is one of a system. So we're going to take a systematic approach, and we're going to realize that actually the systems operate over time, or there's sequences of decisions or sequences of experiences. And I think once you transition from a point or a single state interaction or a decision point, and you move to sequences, you now have to start thinking about the dynamics of the system. So maybe actually what is behind, or the latent idea behind journey analytics is really about modeling the system dynamics. And I think that will play out in both sort of how we want to analyze the system and assess the marginal impact of a user being one point in the process, and also how we might try to optimize over that. And maybe that'll help us think about sort of the complexity of doing something like that.
That makes sense. Gary?
No, I think that's dead on. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, the easiest way to think about this is most of what we do we don't think about customer journey. We think about individual touch points, and we spend most of our time understanding and optimizing individual touch points. And a lot of what I think journey analytics is about is a corrective to maybe a monomaniacal focus on that, right? Individual touch points matter, but there's also this idea that when you string them together, you often get additional information about maybe what the customer was expecting at that touch point, what stage of what their mental map was like at that touch point, what they thought about you, the brand, the product decision, your competitors. All of that gets wrapped in. I mean, from my perspective, a journey really is probably nothing more than a sequence of touches with an accompanying mental map that sort of describes what stage the customer is at and what their mindset is at each of those touch points. So that's kind of the way I think about it. I think what Matt was saying really gets to the heart of why it's different analytically than maybe doing touch analytics.
Well, that's interesting, because I don't know if you did it intentionally, but that actually drives directly into the second question, which is about, when we talk about journeys, are we talking about micro or are we talking about macro? And it sounds like when you're talking about touch points, those could almost be expanded a little bit into the micro journeys, how maybe, the new customer relationship and the things that they do as a new customer versus an existing or long life customer, whatever. So from your perspective, are we talking about, when we talk about journeys, are we talking about like the life cycle of the relationship between the customer and the brand, or is it more narrow in focus, or can it be both? I guess it doesn't have to be one or the other.
I think it clearly can be both. I do think that at some point you may actually transition, and I think maybe this gets. I'm curious what you think, Matt. But at some point, it does feel to me like you may actually go through a significant transition in the methods you're going to apply to something. I mean, I think when you are putting together a sequence of events over time, and obviously almost any events have to be a sequence over time, right? I guess the big distinction is, are they occurring within seconds of each other, minutes of each other, days of each other, weeks of each other? Maybe that doesn't matter, but I tend to think it does. I actually think in a lot of ways that those are fairly distinct processes. So yeah, I do think you can take any journey, look at each individual touch, and look at each individual touch as a micro journey inside of that. But it may be that the analytic methods you're going to use are actually pretty different between those two things. So even though you could say from this abstract level, everything folds up into some kind of journey, you may not want to treat them the same way. And in fact, I probably think you don't.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, I guess it's also how we're thinking about the journey, and maybe just think about the sequence behavior. I mean, is it a task? Is it a task? So is it something that sort of the company is thinking of, and it's a task that they want the customer to achieve, or we want them to achieve? Or is it something like about the customer unfolding into themselves, into more of a customer, a different type of customer? So maybe it's also the perspective of what we're looking to do. And I think Gary's right. It's really about the scope. And I think the more local it is, the sort of the time horizon is going to be a function of what we're going to be thinking about when we're trying to solve these types of problems or analyze these types of problems, I guess, as well as whether or not the stage is something observable or is latent, or we can think of it as a state or a stage. And one way to think about it in sort of a practical, tactical, task-based analysis would be something like, they go to the website, and then maybe they go to the call center, and then you do something at the call center and you try to get them to convert. So that's like something that's sort of micro. It has a certain time horizon around it. It's task-based, and you have sort of observable states. They're at the website at a certain page. They're in the call center at this part of the prompt or whatever. Versus, sort of a different scaling of it is that it's a latent. It's like the customer is searching, or the customer is looking to buy, or it's some sort of latent state. And so it's really going to depend. I don't think we're really going to be able to constrain it to one particular approach. And I think Gary's right. And it's really going to depend upon the problem.
And I just wanted to, David had thrown out that, in the chat, just each interaction is about understanding the job the user is trying to accomplish in that moment, and then chaining those across over time creates the journey. And that's an approach we've taken a lot, actually. I mean, that's like a perfect encapsulation of like what we do with two-tiered segmentation, and then stringing all those intents together into a journey. One thing I will add is that there is sometimes additional elements to the journey that aren't well captured in that kind of paradigm. And Particularly for brands that are either going through catastrophic events. So for instance, if you're Wells Fargo and you are going through a huge public reveal of massive problems of account creation fraud, or you're doing a significant amount of branding work out in the mass media, a lot of the customer journey may be happening in ways that are not customer intent focused and are not happening, in the minds of the customer doing something. And I think that's a part of the journey that honestly we never took much account of. Everything we did was very behavioral. It was very much, David, to what you're talking about there, and that's often the way we thought about it. But there are times when there are big impacts on the customer journey that really aren't customer touches, that are just brand messages or media messages or events happening out in the real world that you have to be aware of. And so I do think customer journey, at least in one sense, has a broader connotation than even that sequence of touches. Sometimes those touches are things that are happening with mass media or media events or exogenous events to the world that we'd have no control over.
Yeah, I wonder too if it's not industry specific as well, right? So a customer journey for a retailer would be, with the short consideration period or life cycle to that journey is extremely short versus, maybe in our financial services world, as an example, we're talking about the life of the customer, right? The entire life from, their first job and starting to save in their 401k to potentially retirement and spend down. And the assembly of things that can happen in a life, right, are very, very hard to predict. And it really, for us, is maybe about, using the data to listen and anticipate what might be the next engagement type that we're going to have with this customer. What have been the engagement types in the past? So again, looking at that formula, the equation, and our brand being on the right-hand side, what to date has been their experience and their taste of our brand? What might be the next opportunity we get to adjust that and pivot it to what we want it to be? And how do we use the data to sniff that out, anticipate that, and deliver the kind of experience that will bring them closer to the brand that we want them to experience?
Rusty, from your guys' perspective, and you probably have a longer, broader customer journey than most other kinds of companies, right? But from your guys' perspective, having kids is a part of the customer journey, right? Or losing your job, or retiring. Those are all fundamental parts of the customer journey that have nothing to do with a touch point with you guys in one sense.
That's correct.
A lot of critical things.
Yeah, that's correct. All those life events that affect, marriage, divorce, children, all those things affect the journey. And that's what I'm saying. For us, it's difficult to anticipate that next thing when all of those things are part of the factors that give us an opportunity to represent our brand in a way, to provide an experience that represents our brand the way that we want to.
That makes a lot of sense. How is it different if you think about the KPIs that you would use in the financial services long, are we talking lifetime value, the elusive, whatever is it metric, or is there another, are you measuring the, intent focused or stage or state focus as Matt referenced? Are you measuring those, and then the health of each of those as you think of it as like a giant funnel, if we apply it, into our web space digital world?
I think. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
You have more experience, so Rusty, I'd rather hear what you have to say than the sound of my voice.
Yeah, no, I'll take a quick stab at it, Matt, and then I'll hand it off. I think, honestly, I think we're transforming around that, right? I think you've got one leg in trying to get an organization very success oriented in their metrics and making sure that they're measuring things and optimizing the correct way to success. And I think journey analytics really brings to bear a completely different evolution of how you measure success, right? In terms of customer stripe, satisfaction. I don't know that traditional NPS scores really are great for this, but one thing I feel strongly about is that not that, you've always wanted to bring quantitative and qualitative analytics together, but I feel like you can optimize pretty well without being really, really good at that, to a goal of conversion or something like that, success event in a measurable way like that. I think when you're talking journey analytics, you've got to be really, really good at bringing qualitative and quantitative data together to really evaluate how that experience or how the customer journey is in the context of quantitative analytics as well.
Well, I agree with that, but like we talked about in one of the huddles at the DA Hub, the NPS itself is not highly correlated necessarily with any of the business goals. So how do we focus on, like, what is the business? I would assume in your case it would be retention.
Retention is a goal. There's probably no singular measure that would say that. I think you've got an idea of what an ideal kind of customer relationship looks like, the kind of customers you want to do business with that represent your core philosophy. And so you've got this idea of who the ideal customer looks like. And I think what we're trying to do, again, is use the opportunity to shape experiences that sum up to the customer's journey in a way that pulls them closer to ideal for representing who we want to be to the customer and the kind of customer that fits well with us, if that makes sense, right? So, you have some business-oriented goals like being an efficient client for us. Maybe we want them to not get their statements through the mail, right? That's a little closer to the perfect client for us. And so maybe you're using some of these opportunities through the journey to pull them a little closer to that. But also, you want them to feel a particular way about, we want them on our philosophy of investing, and we want them on our philosophy of our brand. And so it's an opportunity to represent that each one of these touches along the way and pull them closer to that overall journey being in line with what we would see ideal from both the customer experience and as a client of ours. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me too. And I think it gets at something that I think is important in that conversation you guys are sort of having around metrics, which is that a lot of times the journeys we're talking about are pretty tactical. And I don't think the metrics change all that much, but there are journeys, the longer term journeys, that often involve very strategic elements to the business. And if you're thinking about, let's say you're going to give away your software, your statistical analysis software to colleges, or you're going to give them apples, right? There's no immediate return on that. There's no conversion measure. There's nothing like that, right? So that it's a strategy that has clearly been shown to work, but it's a strategy that takes years to unfold, and in which your chances of successfully measuring the lifetime value of that for any given customer are pretty slim, right? I mean,
couldn't you do a cohort analysis there? Look at your graduating seniors
you could take
2 years from now, if they're more likely to buy Apple.
That's a very long-term analytics strategy, right? How often, I don't know about you guys, but I know as consultants, we rarely get asked to measure programs where people are talking about tell us what happened 3 years later kind of thing, right? I mean, that just does not happen a lot. And so I think sometimes you're having to make those decisions to some extent based on strategy and faith, but there can be, and I think this gets to the voice of customer part of it, there can be really important proxy measures that go along. And, NPS is obviously a very popular one, but even things like, almost all my clients use brand tracking surveys and brand awareness surveys. And, there's no question in my mind that, if you're thinking about long term, I want to position my company so that when millennials have a lot of money, they're going to think about me as the best brand. Knowing the early stage, whether you have made penetration into that market and what their brand awareness is and how they perceive your brand, those are important things. And I think so. I do think that voice of customer, particularly for those more long term strategic journey metrics, those do change. I think a lot of journeys can be measured relatively similar to the way we measure things right now, because they're tight enough in time that we're still looking for the outcomes we're looking for. And Rusty, I think some of the things you talked about, there's a journey to becoming a more efficient client. That might be something that you can pretty efficiently measure without really changing any of your metrics. Mm-hmm. But if you're trying to impact a younger population to think about you a certain mm-hmm. way, I think you're almost going to have to change the metrics you're thinking about, because mm-hmm. that journey is going to play out too long to really make conversion metrics practical.
Right.
I think, one way to blend the two perhaps is just to realize that it doesn't need to be solved in one go. And these problems can be partitioned into like hierarchical problems. And so in a way you have this overarching strategy, as Gary was talking about, which is long-term, but then within it, you still might want to bring this idea of sequential decision-making or system dynamics to your toolkit. And then, because you might have these lower level, more local decisions or more local tasks that do also have their own sort of more local touch points. And so it's more like a program, right? You have this larger program which is trying to execute on some particular high level task, but then it has subroutines, and those subroutines are more local and are solving sort of more tactical problems to help solve the larger. And so, if you think of it that way, you could think of it, it's a way of framing the different hierarchies of scope for these types of problems, but into one formalism.
And I just wanted to call out from the group chat. I am very much on board with the idea that things like Facebook are really great for magic moment targeting, and that's a really nice way to think about blending that data in. And for most businesses, when you start talking about journey, magic moments become a key part of what you're going to think about there. That exogenous data about what's happening in the customer's life usually has some impact on a lot of businesses. It's surprising how many businesses that applies to. And we are blessed in a way to have, both really rich household data from companies like Axiom and incredibly rich social media data these days that I'm not sure companies always take full advantage of. And a lot of times that magic moment philosophy is a really impactful way actually to do your targeting within a broader journey framework.
Well, let me tie some of this back to optimization, if I may, for just a second. If we think about these micro and macro journeys, task-based, stage-based, overall the life, I like the magic moments. I actually haven't heard that phrase before. I'm going to use that from now on. So, do I need to put a little copyright, Gary, by it, or?
No, God, no. That's like, I'm the only one old enough to use that word, right? And we used to talk about this stuff back in like the 70s, I think. So, yeah, you're getting the old direct response speak, right?
I love it.
Not only don't I have a copyright on that, I think it's totally out of like patent copyrightability. So long, so yeah.
Well, it's awesome. Anyway, my question is, what do we do? How do we apply any of this, whether it be, we talk about the metrics, or, if understanding it is one thing, Gary, while we were at Ernst & Young, that was one of our biggest frustrations, is that's why we made the partnership in the first place. It's great. We've got all these fantastic ways to do these deep dive analytics and to really understand, but now let's act. And how do we do that? And that's where you want to tie all these fantastic analyses with some sort of test to evaluate our theories, our models that we've come up with. How do we tie this understanding into optimization?
I'll take a crack at that. I would say, for what Rusty and Gary were talking about with like that larger scale thing, I'm not sure how you could sort of tactically do it, because as Gary says, it is over a very long time horizon. Yep. So to the degree that these more local tactical journey analytics or optimization problems have any value, there are methods from AI that you can use, called reinforcement learning, which basically, reinforcement learning is a problem where you both have to learn by trial and error, right? So by optimization, we're talking about providing different marketing interventions and trying to improve the value of the process or the system, right? A/B testing is one version of that. And then we have this notion of delayed rewards, which is what came up before. And so the conversion event, or whatever goodness reward event occurs, that might take place several steps down the road. So you have these sequential decisions, you have delayed rewards, and you have to make interventions and learn by trial and error. So there are formalisms out there that one can use. And it basically just blends the idea of what you're currently doing with A/B testing, which is trying to estimate the conversion rate of each one of the interventions, but while also factoring in the dynamics, right? The model dynamics, because you might do something to the customer experience and they might convert right then, or it might incent them to transition to some other stage or some other test point. I think that's the whole goal of it in terms of optimization, is to sort of help drive the user through the process in some way that is considered optimal. And that's really going to be up to you or your organization to define what's actually optimal.
You know, I think it's always a race in a webinar with Matt and I to see whether he mentions reinforcement learning before I mention two-tier segmentation. And today he won, but no, I actually think I think that this feels like a classic problem in what you talk about, Matt, in terms of decision control. I mean, this feels like exactly the right area for that kind of application of technique. I'll say too, I'll maybe take it up and tackle those broader problems if you are trying to think about how you might measure those bigger strategic directions. And one of the messages I try to take to people is that we need to apply analytics to big strategic problems too, not just the tactical ones. And if you have a company out there and you're thinking about that, I think there are some things you can do. And some of the things you can do is analyze, for instance, the existing relationship in your population between things like brand awareness, brand, specific brand perceptions. Go out and test. If people feel this way about my company right now, are they more likely to convert? And then go back and test your programs to see whether you're actually creating those attitudes in people. And I think we can be very proactive about figuring out what are the attitudes in consumers that actually cause people to pick us versus our competitors. I think that's actually a very important part of voice of customer that generally gets ignored. And then how can we foster and create those attitudes in programs we're doing with new types of consumers? I think that's a way to prove that what you're doing is going to work or isn't working. Actually, it's good because it actually has a failure and a success attached to it. But I think there are things you can do to set the table for that more strategic analysis. And I think it begins with looking at your existing customer set and really being able to prove what kinds of attitude changes in customers actually lead to success for you and which ones don't. And then you can take that same technique and start to measure it on programs that have a longer term impact. And I think there are ways to tackle those problems. I just don't think we think about them enough.
Hey, Gary and Rusty and Kelly, do you think that the auto industry is a good example of this larger time horizon where they have certain models of cars that they try to get the younger folks in and then they grow them over their life cycle into different products as they sort of age in? In my mind, that's always kind of like the use case for, or an example of this larger, not journey analytics, but sort of journey, building your product and your organization around this idea of life cycle.
Building a
It is. And
relationship with
I think it's a good example of what's good about that and also what's dangerous, right? Because you build these plans and, when I grew up a long time ago, there were Ford men and there were GM, there were Oldsmobile guys and whatever, and that strategy worked really well. And then all of a sudden the world changed, where the Japanese came in and all of a sudden those Ford guys were buying little Japanese cars because they were just a lot better, right? And I think you can. One of the challenges to that kind of long-term life cycle journey planning is that the world tends to change under our feet sometimes in ways that make it pretty useless. And so I think it's a great example. I think it works. And I think there's still in the auto industry a significant amount of that kind of long-term planning. And I think it's a really good example of how it can work, but also some of the dangers associated to it. Because we do analytics, we can prove that something works, but it works in the world we have right now. And that world may not exist in 3 or 5 years.
Yeah, I think the point of perishability is a good one, just in general, but especially when we're talking about
these kinds of big strategic things, right? Those are the ones most likely to go wrong because the world changed underneath you.
I want to flip it on the head.
You've brought that up a couple times.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Gary, you've brought that up a couple times. I think it's a great point. Is sort of as a legacy firm with a great client base, an extremely loyal client base. We can do all of these metrics and assessments to judge how successful we are at creating the kind of journeys and brand recognition that we want to be associated with that. What we may be missing is we aren't segmenting that down far enough to say, where's the displacement audience of the future? And we may be good against our current competitors, but I'm worried about the competitors we aren't thinking about that are building a better experience and journey for customers behind us, taking advantage of a large enterprise's inability to act quickly on this or see them as a competitor. Really nailing that for a different generation that will ultimately displace our current customer base. So I think it's really important to segment those audiences correctly and really understand your future customers and where they're at in that as well. I think that's a really great point you brought up a couple times.
So tying it back again to optimization, using your exact example at Vanguard, if you do that type of segmentation analysis and you identify the segment of people who behave differently, and likely because they're more comfortable on the web than the call center, right? So they don't feel the need to call to do some of the things that maybe the older cohort does. So you take that segment of folks and you find out, if we improve the availability of some of the tasks that they're going to the call center for, if we improve their online abilities to do those things, is that in fact a better experience? Because we've talked in the past about how you really value the call center because that's where a lot of the relationship building is happening. But now you have a new generation of folks that are just starting to save, who might be more interested in usability than that relationship, and having an amazing usability experience might actually build a relationship better than a person on the phone.
Sure, absolutely. And I think again, traditional metrics might be at a loss here to help you because, okay, so we see a pattern towards people doing more things on mobile. We create an onboarding process through mobile. We just shift the online version to mobile ability, right? Great. We feel good about it. Check the box. We've done it. What we aren't recognizing is that the younger generation, yes, while they engage in mobile, their expectations of that experience are completely different, right?
Sure.
Than the experience we're at, and we're losing them, but we aren't seeing the metrics where we're losing those folks if we aren't paying attention to, customer segmentation, audiences, where our brand is resonating and where it isn't. And if we go down into those segments, we start finding pockets that we just simply aren't resonating as strongly as we'd like to be. And now we've got to get into that journey and start understanding where we're not meeting the needs of a class of customer or potential customer, and start adjusting that experience, right?
Rusty, one of the things I think about here, and I think there's lessons that companies can learn from political campaigns, but you look back on the kind of voice of customer research that like the Obama campaign did, and one of the things that they were really good at was micro-tuning their messaging and then checking to see if it was actually resonating with people. So they were doing voice of customer research at a very detailed level to specific populations, testing different messages to those people, and then seeing which ones actually moved the needle on people's opinions. I think when you're talking about some of these kinds of approaches to journey mapping, you need to move beyond, things like NPS. There's scoreboard metrics. They tell you how you ended up making the customer feel, not why the customer feels that way when you get right down to it. And I think that kind of micro tuning of the messaging is something very few enterprises actually do, but would benefit them. And I think there's a trickle up effect too, because as you start to realize what messages actually resonate at a micro level, I think it has a pretty profound impact on your big mass media messages too. So I'd like to see companies, test much more aggressively in the voice of customer realm than they actually do. And Matt, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that kind of testing applies equally well to the sort of stuff you do, right? I mean, it doesn't really matter whether the metrics are behavioral or qualitative, as long as you're actually, putting a process in front of people and actually monitoring what's working and what isn't.
Yeah, no, I think it's the same. You're exactly right. It's the same class of problem, right? You're really trying to learn a controller. You're really trying to figure out what policy, what's the best sequence of actions that I should take in order to like maximize the value of this journey or this process. And so I think the issue is that, how robust is that signal, right? And how informative is the feedback from the world, from the environment, right? And so, if you have good feedback, it doesn't really matter, I don't think, the semantics of the reward signal, the conversion event or the objective. So I would agree.
Meaning you are able to separate what's actually happening from the noise of the data and the impacts.
Well, I mean, but that's the case in any of this. Like that's the larger problem of any analytics or any we'll get to the philosopher here, Gary, which is with inductive logic. I mean, we're operating in this world of our knowledge is based for an analytics is really an empirical science, and so we're always operating under some degree of uncertainty. And so that is the flip side to this approach that we really haven't talked about, is that because we're sort of analyzing a trajectory or we're analyzing over a sequence, it's much more complicated. There's a lot more signal and more relationships that we're modeling. And so the background noise of the problem starts to become even more of an issue. And so, it's the type of thing just to keep in mind when if you're thinking about instantiating something, some sort of analytics or optimization over time or over a system of decisions or touch points, is that, do you have enough signal, right? And is just the complexity of this problem, while reasonable to think about and help you plan over, is it reasonable to ask of the data or ask of your processes? Will you have enough signal there? And so,
and the signal problem is the same problem that optimization programs have all the time when they're just doing basic A/B testing.
correct.
For those of you, that are already planning to be there or not, our next conversation in 2 weeks is about how to get, a bigger lift in your A/B tests, and that's about signal. The whole conversation is going to revolve around: are we pulling the right levers to see an impact, or are we doing these little micro changes that you can't see? The problem just becomes more complex when we're talking about this broad journey, because there's so much more noise that can get in the way of being able to really see that signal. I want to flip it on its head a little bit. There was a conversation that happened in New Orleans. Was that last week, the week before? That was about being customer centric. And I've heard you, Rusty, several times, and Gary several times, talking about framing the journey that you want the customers to have. But Gary, you pointed out, and during that conversation at the DA Hub, that maybe we're thinking about it the wrong way. And instead of thinking of how does our journey that we want them to take, how can we measure that so that we understand and can drive the customers where we want them to go? Maybe it's how can we look at what the customer is doing to understand more about the customer. So I'm curious, if you apply that to journey, what do you think? How does that work?
Kelly, I think you're snooping on my private chat here, because I was having a chat with David, and I think he said something. I think in general, most companies view customers through internal lenses and filters, and not from the point of view of customers.
Exactly.
And I said, yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that's exactly right. And in the conversation you're referring to, one of the traps that I do see, and it came up in yesterday's webinar, is that we tend to think about things as there's a golden path. And I remember, classic example from my past, we were doing work for a large automaker, actually, and outside of the US, a place where they can sell cars directly online, which is great. I don't know why we don't have that. So frustrating. But so a significant percentage of their business is online sales. And one of the questions they had come back to us was, what's the path? What do people do in the visit where they actually buy a car? It was one of, they gave us this big stack of questions, and one of the things we analyzed, well, it turned out that what they did in the path where they bought a car was they clicked on the homepage, they clicked on the car make and model, they immediately clicked on the options they wanted, and then they executed the buy. And the reason was they'd spent on average like 3 months and 13 visits and hours on the site beforehand trying to figure out what they wanted. The buying visit was the least interesting aspect of everything they had done. And I think that gets to the fact that customers there isn't a simple path. When we start analyzing this stuff, what we see is customers show up at touch points in all sorts of random ways with what they want to accomplish in that touch point. And as soon as you start thinking that the web is for people to do research and then they'll come into our stores and buy stuff, you're going to find out, no, customers want to buy online. And maybe some of them want to come into the store to handle the product, but then they actually want to buy the product back in the comfort of their home. There is no one golden path journey. That makes for really complex patterns in the data. And I think that's underlying a lot of what we're saying about journey analytics, is that if you start this journey analytics with the idea that I'm going to hone in on a golden path and figure out how customers should behave, you are going to fail. And that's almost consistently been my finding, looking at the way customers actually behave in the real world.
So you just made the case for A/B testing. Good job.
I think two things I would add to that. I think first, as we talk about customer journeys with our business lines, right? I think their use of the word customer journey is like a 4-letter word to me. Like, they don't really mean it. They mean, I want to understand the customer trajectory, where they're going to be at a given place and time, so I can target my product or service to them, right? It's just smarter firing of bullets, that rather than, I think, to do this well, and Gary, you're saying it, you have to be altruistic in your listening to the data. You have to care about the customer first and try and read that data and understand what their need is, then think about products and services that you have that can help them through that. And apply that accordingly. That's a very different way than we think about analytics traditionally, right?
Yeah.
And then secondly, I agree with Gary too. When, we've got, lots of folks running around trying to do this concept of a customer journey, and they want to get up there and they want to draw this they want to draw it out, right? As though they can understand from birth to death how this thing will play out. And I think you're doing one of two things there. A, you're averaging things up to, even if it were accurate, you'd be averaging things up to such an experience. It would be like going to a psychiatrist, trying to say your problems with your spouse, and then we're saying, well, you're born, you live, you die. Well, that's not helpful to me. That's such an average answer. It doesn't help me with my problem, right? So that's not going to help anyone with a customer journey if we average things up to that level. We're not listening at the right detail to actually affect their journey with us or their experience with us in a way that impacts the journey. So I think we've really got to get good at and Matt was getting at this, sort of that detecting the sequence and order, that as good as we can, listening to that data to try and guess or predict what experience they might be channeling into here, and then just wrap that around a great experience for that one, and let the micro journey sort of assemble into the bigger journey as best they can, right? And try and pull it closer to the experience we want them to have with us along the way.
Yeah, and I think two things about that. One, I think for a lot of companies, customer first is just talk. They don't really mean it. They don't really think that way. They don't really act that way. I do think that there's a role for analytics to help open people's minds to the complexity and nature of the customer journey. And I think part of what we can do with analytics is make it clear to people how complex the customer journey is, what customers need when they show up at particular touch points, and make it clear it's not one thing. I think there's an illustration problem here where, in one sense, we have to show customer maps, right? We have to illustrate these journeys, but every time we illustrate a journey as a series of flat checkpoints, we're somehow reinforcing in people's minds that that's the customer journey, not a customer journey. And that's something we can use analytics to fight against. And I think we just have to be aware of everybody's tendency to, if they see one journey map, to think that's the map, not a map. And I think that's something that data can be used very effectively to fight against, but you have to use the data if you're actually going to tell that story.
But then again, once we have those stories and we have multiple paths, I mean, it's really no difference than many different segmentation, than the two-tier segmentation analysis that you might do. And you have this group of people, and unless you can deliver a different experience, why does it matter?
Yeah.
I'm not as optimistic that the data is gonna save you. I think the organization. I think it's kind of orthogonal to whether we're talking about journey analytics or anything else. I think either the organization just culturally appreciates looking at it from a customer view, or they don't. And I'm not sure that if the culture is not to look at it that way, that the analytics is gonna have a strong hand to change the way it looks. I think it is useful to, at least for me, it's useful to abstract this problem. Just what are the dynamics of the existing process, right? Because if you think about it, you have some sort of existing process, and what the process is, or the system is that's the hard work for you guys to think about, or for one to think about what are the important ways of defining our existing marketing system or marketing process. By that I mean website, or people going to Facebook, or going into the store, whatever that happens to be. And I think the analytics part is, what is the model? What are the transition, like by dynamics, I mean, like, how do people transition from one point to another point, right? But that's just an existing shadow, or reflection of what the existing process is. And then when we're talking about optimizing, we want to make interventions. We want to perturb that existing system in some way. We want to prod it or poke it in such a way that the transitions change, or maybe we were adding additional important touch points so that it can flow in such a way that increases in value. And it may very well be that, there's different types of interventions that we make for different types of users, and different users can transition around. And so this might be somewhat complicated, but I still think it's important just to frame it that way, to think about it that way, is that we're really trying to learn the dynamics of a system. And that's what makes it different, is just right when we go from one touch point to two, we now have dynamics, and that's the complex part. And we might want to start drawing from outside fields that have kind of studied these things and pull that in. And we don't have to instantiate them to the same degree, but it's just as a mental model to think about it, and thinking about control and thinking about policy, which is how we perturb that system to improve its value. I don't know if that was gobbledygook, but
no.
To me, that's a useful way to think about it.
I want to ask Joe's question out loud for anybody who's not reading the chat, because I think it's pretty timely right this second. Joe from Comcast asked, do we need to be journey sequence agnostic? And if we do, how then do you manage a micro touch point with anticipation of customer needs?
I'll take my best crack at that. And I guess I do think that what we tend to do is think about channels and touch points as having specific purposes. And then we design the touch point for that purpose. And a lot of times when we then study it, we find that's not how the customers are thinking about it at all. So there is, I think, a necessary agnosticism in your thinking, where I like to encourage people to think about touch points as necessarily being able to handle a fairly wide variety of customer use cases. It's not to say that every touch point is going to handle every use case, because it probably won't. And sometimes its handling of a use case may be nothing more than making an easy pass off to another touch point, right? I mean, sometimes there are customer support issues that cannot be resolved on the web. When that's the case, the web should just ensure that it makes for an easy pass off to the right place in the call center. And if it's done that, it's done its job. That's all that channel can do, because you can't resolve the problem on the web. So I think from that perspective, you do what you want to think about is, when someone lands at a touch point, how can I make my best guess? And I think this gets to some of the things Matt's talking about. How can I make my best guess about what they need right now, given where I think they are in their journey stage? How can I make sure that if my guess is wrong, it's not disastrous? And how, as that decision unfolds, can I, as quickly as possible, make that touch point meet their needs and make it successful? And I think those are the three things you need to worry about. How good an idea do you have of what someone is trying to do when they hit a touch point? How quickly can you find out if you're right or wrong? And how can you best optimize that micro journey within that touch point? And those are three pretty distinct problems, it seems to me. Each one is an interesting optimization problem in its own right.
Now, Gary, what do you think about just a touch point is a place where we're willing and able to make a decision?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. So it's not about what decisions the customer is needing to make or what their tasks they're trying to accomplish, but it's more about where we're willing and able to react to what the customer.
Otherwise, what difference does it make? I mean, if you're not going to be able to do anything, so what? I mean, you would just redefine the touch point where you're not doing anything as a reward or some sort of micro conversion or something. But I'm not sure how useful it is. Now, obviously, we would probably the willingness to make it a decision point is probably going to be correlated with the fact that it's probably some important part for the customer. But maybe we just think of it as these are just the points where you're willing and able to make some sort of intervention. And that's what a touch point is.
That is really interesting. I kind of like that. That's certainly how, when we think in digital optimization, we don't focus on the parts that we can't test. There's not enough traffic, we're not going to focus on that. So if we can't make a change, we don't even measure it. I'm not saying it's right, but it's certainly practical. Well, we have 5 minutes left. I want to give anybody on the call the opportunity to ask one last question. Please go off mute or type it in the chat, whatever you want, before we thank our guests and say goodbye for today.
feel like David should go off mute.
I know, right?
I think I said probably too much already.
No such thing.
No, I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting aspects, and obviously it's not an easy problem, right? I mean, every customer, every department, every person that interacts with customers has a different opportunity to engage with the user. I think one of the things that I found to be helpful in optimization is to kind of, and I'm still working on it because I don't think I'm very good at it, incorporating the voice of the customer. So oftentimes we'll ask somebody like, why are you doing this? Or why is this important to you? Before we ask, is this important to you? So really understanding that what are the underlying motivations? It could be an intrinsic motivator, it could be an external motivator, but understanding like maybe the emotional component of why somebody's trying to do something will give you an idea of how to potentially take a different angle. And I think to go back to whether or not it's applicable for an A/B test, or maybe it's, to me, an A/B test is just verification of a hypothesis.
Yes.
And oftentimes I think some folks end up doing A/B testing just to do A/B testing, and it's a waste of time and energy, and money, quite frankly. So
Yes.
I think the important part is to find where you could have the potential largest impact on a user. And, to me, the journey is really about probability of an action happening. So if for us, somebody comes to our website for the very first time, that wasn't something that we could have predicted because we never knew that person. How likely is it they're going to come back? And then what action within that moment can we take to increase the probability of that person coming back? And understanding what the original intention of that user was and what they get out of it from a psychological perspective. I think oftentimes we leave that off the table and we think that people are just automatons and just going through their day. And in reality, most of our decisions are made without us even knowing that we're making them. So to me, understanding the voice of the customers really helps kind of prioritize where we put our resources, because I think prioritization is the hardest problem for both analysis, just what are we focusing in on, as well as optimization. Where do we have the biggest opportunity for improvement?
Well, I think
that wasn't a question, that was just rambling. So sorry.
No, I think that's great. And I think a lot of it from my perspective, I think you're dead on that so much of what we are doing with A/B testing, getting back to Matt's point, is figuring out where we can prod and perturb the system. Where can we make changes that are actually going to result in different decisions and different outcomes down the line? And I do think that's the hard, in some senses, that's the hard problem is how do we figure out where to invest in those kinds of changes? And I do think voice of customer is a great answer to that. Having said that, I'm not going to understate how challenging voice of customer is, especially these days. It's very difficult to actually get people to engage with you a lot of times in a voice of customer channel. I think we've had real struggles with that across every different way we've tried to do it, except maybe focus groups, and that's a valuable technique, but somewhat limited. But that's the one area of voice of customer that hasn't gotten significantly worse in the last 30 years. Almost every kind of survey stuff we do has gotten harder to get a representative sample, harder to get people to engage, and harder to get information out of people. So there definitely are challenges in using those techniques.
Well, there's one area, usertesting.com is relatively new, and that is easy and way less expensive than focus group. But David, I'm big fan of using VOC to not just prioritize, but for your brainstorming and ideation. I mean, I think it's the #1 source for finding the friction points and the areas that you're going to be able to have the most impact. And it absolutely should feed into every ideation and prioritization model. Otherwise, we're just testing to test, and that's a losing proposition.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we literally, we'll launch a survey and then at the end just ask if people are willing to have exactly what we're doing here, and just, it's a remote.
A remote conversation. Interesting.
So you could do a user interview from anywhere in the world. It doesn't need to be a complicated in-person focus group. It could literally be, hey, here's some new designs. What are you thinking? We get 6 people to give us their feedback. We make changes. We throw it into, we use user Zoom instead of user testing. We put on some unmoderated tests and tasks for them to accomplish. We get some feedback. So the point that I was trying to make before is that it's not so much, you're not going to figure it out in one fell swoop. It's going to be iterations.
Yeah, there you go. Yep.
And to us, I think to the point that was made before about like, how do you anticipate the needs of a user, like a younger user who's just maybe getting into investing? To me, it's using, I'm just a big fan of using elements of design thinking and then understanding where there might be a hypothesis. To me, the hypothesis is just, you know, you can do A/B testing as one way to validate it, but there are other ways to do it as well. And, you know, when we've redesigned our mobile app, for example, the first step that we did was we literally drew pictures on paper, went down onto the street and asked people if, you know, these overall ideas made sense. And after the guerrilla testing, we then made an interactive prototype and then asked people to click around on it. So at every state of developing a new product or service, there's an opportunity to learn and make sure that it's aligned with what the user is actually doing in the real world. Because that's the hard part, is somebody tells us what they're doing is actually different than what they're doing from day to day and from minute to minute.
That's excellent. Well, I hate to wrap it up. It's been an amazing conversation, but I do need to, since we're at the bottom of the hour, top of the hour, whichever way that goes. Gary, Rusty, Matt, thank you so much. Thank you for all the participants, for the interesting questions and comments in the chat. And don't forget, 2 weeks from now, we'll be back, and panel still TBD, but we'll be talking about how to make bigger changes to see bigger lifts in your A/B testing. So thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.